So allow me to introduce our august speaker, our first speaker, Phyllis Bennis. Phyllis Bennis is a writer, activist, political commentator, and fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. In 2001, so she's been doing this work a long time, she co-founded the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and she's been a board member of Jewish Voice for Peace, where she continues to serve as international advisor. She works with many anti-war and Palestinian rights organizations, writing and speaking widely across the U.S. and around the world. She has addressed the UN General Assembly, served as an informal advisor to several top UN officials on Middle East issues, and was twice shortlisted to become the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. She has written and edited 12 books, which is astonishing, incredible, and including a popular series of Middle East primers, as well as Before and After U.S. Foreign Policy and the War on Terror, and Challenging Empire, How People, Governments, and the UN Defy U.S. Power. Most recently, 2025, hot off the press, she has written Understanding Palestine and Israel, which you can see here, and I believe is available somewhere. So please join me in welcoming Phyllis Bennis.
Thank you all. Thank you for being here today on this very difficult day. Thanks especially to the conference team, to Feta and Derek and Aaron, and very huge thanks to Francesca, a longtime friend of mine as well, who we have not been able to engage with since this sanctioning. This is a sanctioning of us as well. And thank you especially to Reverend Christine and the church. This is what churches should do. This is what churches should be. And it's a wonderful thing to be part of a church that recognizes that. You know, I was supposed to talk about the importance of history and how history comes to bear with the situation we're looking at with Palestine today. And it is important. It's important that we recognize the question of history and not leaving behind history as we work to avoid the distortion and erasure of history, as we see the erasure of the Palestinian people that the US and Israel are trying to impose, and the fight back around the world to say, no, you will not erase these people, this land, and this struggle, and this history. This history becomes so important. This is a moment when Gramsci becomes very important here. We are living in a time of monsters. I wanted to talk a little bit about another great historian, although he wasn't called a historian and didn't think of himself necessarily as a historian, and that was Edward Said, who many of you have read his works. I had the privilege of working with him in the last years of his life, in looking at the question of what would it take to build a movement supporting Palestine and supporting Palestinian rights in the United States. And he talked about, and some of you may have read his book, Palestine from the Vantage Point of Its Victims, that one of the huge challenges facing Palestinians historically was the fact that Palestinians were being oppressed by those who for so long had been identified as the victims of the world. The victims of the victims. And that was true. That was true. European Jews were the worst victims of genocide in the Western world up until that time. There had been other genocides. There was the genocide carried out also by Germany, interestingly, in what is now Namibia. There were other genocides. As the great Iqbal Ahmed once said, the history of our time is studded with unrecorded holocausts. That's very real. That's a very real part of our history. But another aspect of why the struggle for Palestinian rights, particularly the national rights, the right of self-determination, which is taken for granted for everyone else, is that the clearest component of the Palestinian struggle, which of course did not begin in 1948. It goes back 100 years. It goes back to the first seizure of land by Europeans who came to that land with different excuses, some religious, some political, some with the notion of colonialism as a great boon to the world, all kinds of reasons. But the result was the same for the victims. And in that moment, we do see a change with the Nakba in 1947 and 48, when 750,000 Palestinians were stripped of their land and forced out of their land, never to be allowed back, and their descendants never to be allowed back. Despite international law as it evolved over the years, the Palestinians were exempt from that law. And what you had was a moment when the era of decolonization was on the rise in 1947 and 48. 1948 was an extraordinary year. You had the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You had the signing of the Treaty Against Genocide, the International Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in 1948. And you had the Nakba, and you had in South Africa the consolidation of apartheid, all in one kind of amazing year. And it's in that context that the Palestinian struggle took on a new and more visible shape. But it was a struggle against settler colonialism at a moment when decolonization was for the first time overtly on the agenda. And anti-colonial struggles were being waged and won all over the world. So the United Nations in that time became not only a venue where sort of the negotiations would happen and the other stuff would happen, but it was also a player. You know, the first thing that newly independent governments would do would be to send a delegation to the General Assembly to take their seats in the hall of the world's powers, to say this is an institution for all of us. You know, there's a funny, well, not a funny, there's a amusing story at the founding of the UN, when it met in a couple of different capitals until they got the land in New York, donated by the Rockefellers, to build a UN headquarters. And the designers, the architects, went to the leaders of the UN and said, you know, we're putting together this big hall that will be the hall of the General Assembly, the hall for all nations around the world, right? And how many countries do you think are going to be represented? At that time, there were 51 members of the United Nations, almost all of them white colonial countries, a few others, a couple of Asian countries, almost no African countries except a couple in Northern Africa. It was really pretty shameful. But they recognized that over the years there would be more, and they would welcome them. They said, there might be as many as 70. Build it for that. Today there are 194 independent countries in the United Nations. That does not include Palestine. Palestine is a member of certain UN agencies, but it is not yet a member state of the United Nations. And the UN these days is playing a role that is, again, not only a venue, but now in reversal of its role in the struggle for decolonization. It is playing the role of legitimizing and justifying a new colonial regime in Gaza. So one of the crimes, if I can say that, of the United Nations Security Council, it's not the first, but it's maybe the newest. In November of last year, when the Security Council responded to this call for a creation in Gaza of a Mediterranean Riviera with huge towers and beaches and cafes, and people from all over the world would come and they would stay there and they would go fishing and they would swim in the Mediterranean. And where were Palestinians in this picture? They had been erased by those who were planning this. And when that proposal, in the form of the 20-point peace plan, quote, of the United States president, instead of saying this is illegal, you are supporting the genocide that has been going on already for 2 years, this is unacceptable, and we are going to pass a resolution that is going to hold you accountable. The Security Council did not say that. The Security Council went much further than to not say that. They passed an explicit resolution endorsing, embracing the 20-point proposal, something that had never been done before. Never been done before. They never had passed a resolution endorsing one country's proposal for what should happen in another country whose occupation and apartheid and genocide it was funding. It was kind of the opposite of what the United Nations was created to do. So when we talk about Edward's work in looking at the challenge facing Palestinians as being the victims of victims, we are now looking at that in the context of not yet the full loss, but as we just heard, the weakening, the attacks on the United Nations. I don't mostly blame the United Nations. You know, the United Nations as a political entity doesn't really exist. It is an amalgam of 194 nation states. The powerful nation states at the United Nations are the ones I blame, most especially our government. Our government is responsible more than any other. There's plenty of others that have played not such a great role over the years, but it is the government of the United States who has dominated the United Nations since its origins. Since the preliminary process in the run-up to the first planning meeting to create the United Nations, when the precursor of the CIA, the OSS, figured out a way to surveil the delegates on their way, on their trains. I don't even know how they did that, but in those days they figured it out. So they came into that diplomatic process already having violated the diplomatic rights of everybody else in the world. So in the context of today's world, and what began today as many of us expected it to, I had a piece that was supposed, I had finished writing yesterday about Iran and why some of the lessons of Iraq both show us why war with Iran by the United States and Israel was almost certainly going to happen, and why the lessons of Iraq show us why it will probably be worse this time than the horrific realities of the war in Iraq. I wrote that the day before yesterday. It was going to run in the Nation tomorrow, and they called me this morning and said, "Can you update it so we can run it now?" You know, so yeah, you can look for that in the next couple of days. This is a moment when we think about the old world dying, but the new world is not yet born, the words of Gramsci. We know the old world is dying. What we don't know is what is going to be born. The hope that this new world is going to be a world of multilateralism in a true sense, where governments are equal. And we're not even talking here about gunboat diplomacy. We're talking about just gunboats. You know, there's no diplomacy here. Trump was very clear about this. This was not an attack, was not going to be an attack aimed at using some military pressure to get them to come to the table with some better ideas. We're not doing that. He said it explicitly. This is a moment, I tell all Iranians, take cover because we are going to bomb everywhere. But when it's over, you will have a new world, a new something. He said, this is about regime change. We don't know what it's going to look like. We know what it has looked like so far. So far, we know that at least one girls' elementary school in a port city in Iran that was hit this morning, where at least 51 people were killed, that dozens of them were children. That's what we know. We don't know the rest. We don't know the rest. But we know that the struggle for Palestinian rights, and right now that means also for Palestinian lives that are being erased in a physical way, day after day after day. There is no ceasefire underway in Gaza. There has been a reduction of direct military casualties, yes, and that's very good because we're talking about people's lives. We are not now seeing 100, 150 people shot, bombed, droned to death every day. But we're seeing 17, or 31, or 12, or 2. That is not a ceasefire. And that does not even take into account the numbers who are dying of starvation, of the cold. People are living homeless. 2 million people trying to live in tents, trying to live in unfinished shells of the few buildings that were not completely bombed. And we're hearing about, well, there's 70 million tons of rubble in Gaza. We think that we can grind that into powder to make cement and start rebuilding and build this grandiose set of hotels and cafes and parasols on the beach. And no one is asking the people of Gaza, do you want to make cement out of these buildings when that includes the bones of your children and your elders who died when those buildings were collapsed? No one's asking. No one's asking. The Palestinian voice is being erased. And the other reason that Palestinian lives and the Palestinian struggle for life and freedom is facing so many clearer dangers right now is that today we are facing an extraordinary kind of contradiction. On the one hand, Palestinians are facing the worst conditions of life, certainly in Gaza, under a clear genocide, but also in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem and in the diaspora, where people are unable to send aid to their families and certainly unable to return home. But we are also seeing that happening at two contradictory moments. On the one hand, as a result of that genocide of the last 2.5 years, we are seeing a rise in the Palestinian rights movement, particularly here in the United States, unprecedented in our history. We have seen protests, the multi-100,000 person protests that Francesca mentioned. Yes, we saw those. How many of you have been in DC for any of the big protests? A lot of people. But what's even more important than that, I think, is that we are seeing and continuing to see and have seen protests all over the country that are not of 400,000 people in Washington, D.C., but are 150 people in the town square, in towns and cities across this country. That's a whole different world that we have not seen before. We saw the rise of a whole parallel movement. People who had not been involved in the Palestinian work before had really never paid much attention to Palestine. A lot of them had supported Israel, had just instinctively gone along with the dominant narrative in this country that says Israelis are the good guys, Israel is a democracy, Israel is our best friend and ally, Israelis are like us, meaning they're white. That's a very powerful and popular view in this country. And we have seen too many people who have believed that. But many of those same people now are saying, wait a minute, this is not okay. And part of the reason that that history is going to be different is precisely because one of the differences, we just heard about 3 ways in which the Gaza genocide is different than other genocides. I would add a 4th, which is that the genocide since October of 2023 has been the first one that has been publicized and bragged about by the perpetrators. By the perpetrators. You know, the reason that international legal officials have always said that genocide is such a difficult case to prove. You know, you look at mass killings and say, well, of course it's genocide, it's obvious. Well, genocide requires something else. Unlike a lot of international law, the laws against genocide are actually pretty simple. You need at least 1 out of 5 specific acts, violent acts, killing, injuring, creating conditions that make the possibility of a group surviving impossible. But you also need something else. You need proof of intention. And that's really hard to do. Until this time, when Israeli soldiers and military figures and political leaders and poets and songwriters and people bragged about it and said, we are going to get them all. They are all our enemy. This is not a war against Hamas. This is a war against people. This is a war against Palestinians. And we have the right to do it. That was different. That was different. And I think that's an important thing. But the contradiction is we have the worst conditions ever, and we have this extraordinary movement at the same time. And that movement rising in a time when the whole world is mobilizing against the rise of fascism. And the link between genocide in one place and fascism at home is a very clear one. The work of the great Martinique Marxist poet and analyst, Aimé Césaire, who said that colonialism is brought home as fascism. We're seeing that now in the United States. We're seeing it in Israel. And ironically, I think it's one of the reasons that that parallel movement, the ceasefire movement, if you wish, that was somewhat different than the Palestinian rights movement that had already been in existence and became bigger and stronger through this period, but was different. It was in parallel. And that's where many of the people have gone to work more on the question of how do we stop the rise of authoritarianism and fascism here at home. And that's a good thing that they're doing that. That's desperately needed. And our challenge is, how do we keep Palestine as the moral core of that movement, even as we build that movement against fascism and authoritarianism? And I want to just say one thing about how that happens. You know, there have been these incredible big protests recently, the No Kings stuff, and before that it was the hands-off protests. And these are amazing. They're going on in literally thousands of towns and cities across this country, rejecting everything that this administration is standing for. And that's a great thing. And for example, in the list, you remember in the first of the hands-off protests, there was a whole list that was put out of hands off this, hands off Medicaid, and hands off Medicare, hands off Social Security, hands off, hands off, hands off. There was no reference to hands off Gaza. And there was a lot of opposition to that. A lot of people were pretty upset about it. But two things were more important in some ways than people being upset about it. One was a lot of people went to those protests with their keffiyehs and with their flags and with their signs and putting Palestinians and Palestinian rights at the center of that movement. That was the first thing that was important. The second, that was even more important, in my view, they were welcomed by everybody else, right? You didn't hear people saying, oh, you know, really, you guys should be somewhere else. This is not about that. This is about, we're trying to stop this. People said, maybe you heard it in a couple of places, but this was not dominant. The dominant mood was welcoming. It was welcoming, saying, we're so glad you're here. Thank you. That was huge. I happened to be that day, I was in, where was I? New Haven. You know, so it was a relatively small protest. There were like 2,000 people. It was energetic and whatever. There were 3 separate Palestine contingents in that group of a couple thousand people. And all the people around them, I was watching, were going up to them and saying, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for bringing your flags, for bringing your chants. That's incredibly important. One of the things we have to figure out how to deal with, one of the reasons that this is such a contradiction at a moment when Palestinians are facing the worst challenge of their national life, and for 2 million people, the worst challenge to their physical life, the existence of their children, their elders, their families. We are also seeing the polls. The polls in this country, and you know, polls are a snapshot, right? You can't put a whole lot of trust in polls. But when poll after poll after poll after poll all say the same thing, moving in the same direction, you've got a trajectory on your hand, then you pay attention to the polls. Let me tell you just a couple of them. In August of last year, 62% of all voters opposed any more military aid to Israel. That's unprecedented. Never happened before. 75% of Democrats said no more aid to Israel. That's particularly interesting because you can say, well, Democrats are more likely to be more liberal than the Republicans. That's probably true. But historically, when I was a kid growing up, it was Democrats who supported Israel. Republicans wanted no truck with Israel. Part of it was anti-Semitism. Israel is filled with Jews. We don't like Jews, right? That was the sense of a lot of Republicans. Israel was a liberal issue. It was a progressive issue. I grew up believing Israel was a socialist country. When I grew up as a young Zionist in California, that's what we were taught. We talked about the kibbutz movement. We talked about the unions. We never asked, whose land was it before that happened? And nobody encouraged us to ask those questions. That's true for an awful lot of people in this country. But right now, it's the other way around. Right now, support for Israel is overwhelmingly a Republican issue. It's a partisan issue. AIPAC's longstanding goal of making support for Israel bipartisan consensus, done. It is no longer a bipartisan consensus. We still have a lot of work to do, but the fact that AIPAC alone has become so toxic that even mainstream members of Congress are refusing to take AIPAC money because it makes them look bad. Wow. This is the contradiction. This is what's going on while Palestinians are continuing to be killed by Israeli bombs paid for by our tax money. That's the contradiction we're looking at. Another poll in October of last year, poll of Jewish voters. 61% of Jewish voters say Israel is committing war crimes. 61%. 39% are saying Israel is committing genocide. 39% of American Jewish voters. 50% of young Jewish voters say Israel is committing genocide. And I'll tell you just one more poll, because I know people, your eyes glaze over with too many polls. But this one's really interesting. Taken in March of last year, after the elections, the poll was of a very narrow group of people. People who voted for Biden in 2020 and did not vote for Biden in 2024. So it included people who voted for Trump in 2024, people who didn't vote at all, people who voted for members of Congress but didn't vote for president, people who voted for some alternative party, for the Green Party or something, people who voted for Mickey Mouse. It included anybody who voted for Biden, did not vote for Harris. And it said, we want to know the most important reason why you didn't. We know it's usually a lot of reasons, but pick the most important one. And they gave them 6 options. When I heard about it, I thought, okay, the first one's going to be the economy, right? And then the big question is, what's second and third? Wrong. Way wrong. The first was Gaza. The most important reason, 29% of the people who did not vote for Kamala Harris in 2024 did not vote for her because she refused to break, the Democratic Party refused to break with Biden's support for genocide. That's huge. We're not hearing much about that poll. That's apparently in also the DNC poll that they just took that they're keeping secret. But we know, because there was an earlier poll that's not secret, that was commissioned by the great work of the Institute for Middle East Understanding. Okay, enough with polls. Let's come back to the history question, why history is so important here. If we look at the history of this genocide, this is not something that began in response to a sudden burst of violence on October 7th that just happened, that had no history, that had no idea this could happen. Why would this happen? This just was out of the blue, so shocking. What happened on October 7th and the response to it that began within 12, 15 hours were direct descendants of 100 years of settler colonialism. That doesn't mean that everything that happened on October 7th was legitimate. It certainly was not. There were war crimes committed by the Palestinian side on that day. Not everything that happened was a war crime. Not everything that happened was illegal. An occupied population has the right under international law to fight back against occupation, and that right is limited by the same rights of the laws of war as the Geneva Conventions that say that applies to attacking soldiers and military targets and not civilians. So we need to be very clear about both of those realities. But what is, I think, important here, we're looking now 75 years after the Nakba, 75 years after that this happens, after the creation of the State of Israel. We have a clear, stated act of genocide, and we have, in that context, the facts on the ground are the facts of genocide, taking advantage of genocide to say we're going to reclaim that land for illegal settlement. You know, that's what's interesting. There's a little bit of a divide here between the the real estate people, the son-in-law and his partner, who are both real estate agents, who want to create one set of facts on the ground with the fancy hotels and all of that, and the Israeli settlers who want to go back and build Israeli settlements there, right? So there's a little bit of a contradiction in how that's going to move forward. But it does go to the question of what it means to remember how history gives rise to consequences that can be decades, half a century, 3/4 of a century later. So that brings us to the question of our responsibility. What does that mean? Our responsibility, for those of you who believe, and looking around the room, I think a lot of you believe, that social change anywhere happens because of mass movements to change it. It doesn't change because one person gets elected with some good idea and puts, a report on the desk of some powerful person somewhere. And it's like, oh, let's do this. This is a whole new idea. It happens because it becomes impossible not to do it, right? So we have this obligation about what movement building looks like. And understanding the history of our movement, the movement for Palestinian freedom, is very important. I mentioned how progressives and liberals supported Israel in the 1950s and 60s, including right up and through the 1967 war. I was one of those kids at the Hollywood Bowl running up and down the steps collecting the checks from people who were putting money in to fund Israel's war against the Palestinians of what it was left of historic Palestine, the 22% that was all that was left of historic Palestine. So you have that movement. And then shortly after that, you have the rise in the rest of the world, particularly in the United States, where you have the rise of a movement saying, no, Palestinian rights have to be on the table here. Palestinian rights have to be one of the many sets of rights around the world that we are fighting for. And you saw it first in black freedom organizations, SNCC, and the Black Lives Matter, the Black Panther Party, all supported Palestinian rights. It wasn't a major part or the major part of what they did, so many people never heard that what the Black Panthers were doing. They heard about the breakfast program for children. They heard about the domestic work of the BPP. They didn't hear much about that support, but that support did exist. It existed earlier when SNCC took a position in 1967 supporting Palestine. And then SNCC members went off to Africa when the first African countries were winning their independence. Harry Belafonte writes in his extraordinary memoir of the civil rights movement. Harry was a dear friend and part of our board, so I always like to be able to talk about this part. He put together a delegation of young SNCC activists who had spent 2, 3, 5 years being shot at and being beaten bloody in the South in the civil rights activism work they were doing. He took them to Africa to show them what an independent black African country could look like, right? So, you have all of this anti-colonial work coming together here in this movement. On the other hand, you had the reality that what anti-colonialism meant was different things. You had for example, in the Soviet Union, there was a lot of support for Zionism as a bulwark against British colonialism. And that led to a lot of people in the United States, in and around the Communist Party, supporting Israel as well. So there were lots of different, factors that were underway. More recently, and I'm going to just go another couple of minutes and then we're going to open up for discussion about all of this. In more recent history, during this last 2.5 years of genocide and devastation, we've had 2 years where Palestine has been acknowledged as the moral center of the entire progressive movement, especially for young people who grew up as the justice generation in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement after the killings in 2014 in Ferguson, and then the killings that went on and on, the police killings over and over again until George Floyd in 2020. And in that context, you had the rise of these two parallel movements, and what we now face is a situation where the Zionist movement in the US that is pushing so hard for support for Israel, support for paying for the genocide, has given up the effort to persuade people. They've lost the battle, and they've recognized it. And what they're doing instead is the repression of our movement. And this is where we are now. This is why we're seeing what's happening at Columbia. And we're seeing now ICE taking this on at Columbia University. You all saw what happened a couple of days ago. And Mamdani managed to get her out quickly. That was quite something. But what we need to do is figure out how to move further and faster. And I want to pose, as the last thing I mention here, an example of what our movement could be. We've been hearing from several speakers this morning already about the challenge of international law. And Susan Akram is going to be speaking later about the fundamentals of international law in this situation. But I want to say just one thing about international law. And that is, as important as it is in all kinds of ways, its biggest weakness is the lack of enforcement capacity, right? So some parts of international law, like decisions of the International Court of Justice, are supposed to be binding in international law. But when a powerful country says, yeah, well, we don't agree, so we're going to walk away, they not only don't have an army, they don't even have a police force. They don't even have like a process server that could go and serve the subpoenas. They have to depend on governments. And we know where that goes. So what's the model that we look at? We look to the model of the South Africa era anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s, where over and over again, government after government after government went to the Security Council with incredible proposals for sanctions, for banking sanctions, for arms embargoes, for all kinds of things, to pressure South Africa to abandon its apartheid policies. And over and over again, the US, and occasionally the Brits as well, but always the US, would veto. It would go to the General Assembly, it would be voted up in huge majorities of the world, and the US would say, yeah, but General Assembly resolutions don't count in international law. Security Council measures supposedly do, but the General Assembly officially don't. They're just advisory. But what happened? In country after country, people took those lists, those menus of the kinds of sanctions, the kinds of embargoes that were needed, starting with an arms embargo, took them to their own governments and built anti-apartheid movements in their governments and said, we don't care whether it's binding or not, we're going to hold you to it. We are going to be the enforcers of international law. And that's what we have to do now. The Security Council has vetoed resolution after resolution to stop the genocide in Gaza. But the General Assembly, in September of last year, passed an extraordinary resolution under the terms of the Uniting for Peace precedent at the UN, calling for an arms embargo, calling for sanctions, banking sanctions, trade sanctions, you name it, it's there. It goes further than any BDS campaign ever went, I gotta say. But it takes each government to enforce it. So we need to partner with all those movements around the world that are pressuring their own governments to be the model of that South African successful movement. And we have to recognize that unlike South Africa, where people were terribly oppressed throughout the apartheid years, they were not facing genocide. It took 15 years to change that policy in South Africa. We don't have 15 years left. Palestinians are dying in their thousands. And that's our job, to figure out how to use that model, how to build on that model in the context of the urgency of now. It's a huge challenge, but it's the challenge of this moment when we are living in a time of monsters, and it's our job to overturn them. Thank you. Move this out of the way. Now we get the fun part. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, did I Can you all hear me? Did I do it?
Got it.
Okay. All right. Can we thank our wonderful speaker, Phyllis Bennis, just one more time? Thank you so much for that. That was just wonderful. Well, my head is spinning, and I imagine I'm not the only one. Oh, thank you. Better? Okay. Anyone in the back and also in the front feel absolutely authorized anytime I have a bit of a soft voice. So if you ever can't hear me, don't hesitate, to yell out, to raise a hand or anything at any point. I was just saying that my head is spinning with so many thoughts and questions. I imagine that's true for everyone. There is such a wonderful energy in this room. So we're going to open it up really quickly. Maybe I'll just offer some initial, very quick kind of reflections on just the way that you talked about the importance of history, I think, and the specific histories you brought us, right? So I think having us think with Said, right, and the importance of kind of thinking with and learning from Palestinians in the context of this, what Palestinian thinkers have called the ongoing Nakba, right? Nakba is process. Nakba is something that doesn't start in 1948 and certainly doesn't start in 2023 and continues, right? So thinking about processes of colonization and how those are connected around the world as we speak, from unceded Wabanaki lands, and thinking about, like you said, with Césaire, the ways that colonization abroad is related to brings fascism home, but then also the connections between movements that you highlighted so much as you brought us to this question of our responsibility, right, and where we are today, and the urgency that you ended on of the need for us to act together. So those are just a few of the things that kind of really sparked for me, but I imagine there's lots for so many of you here. I wonder if anyone wants to start us off with a question, a reflection, a thought. I see hands already. So we've got a couple of microphones. I don't know if you want to come up to the microphones. And if people, if coming up to the microphone is difficult for people, I don't know if there are possibilities for microphones to be brought to folks in the audience. That might also be possible. Do you want to go ahead and start us off, and then maybe we'll move back and forth?
Hello? Is that working? Thank you, Phyllis, for the historical perspective. I think it's so important. Thank you. I'm thanking Phyllis for the historical perspective. And I wonder, Phyllis, you can push it back a little bit to talk about the history of Zionism and its creation, largely with the connivance and the direct support of white Anglo-American leaders, which also takes it back to templates for settler colonialism that existed in places like Namibia, East Africa, and the Congo, where Harry Belafonte was also instrumental in publicizing the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, where we see now another genocide taking place, as well as in Sudan, as well as in Somalia, Libya. So there's a whole history of multinational genocides, usually perpetuated by white Anglo-American entities. And that's also indicative of the link to Zionism in Palestine, and that the initial push by Anglo-American powers to deal with the problem of the Jews of East Africa was to create homelands for Jews unwanted in Eastern Europe, in Patagonia, in Uganda, and elsewhere. So that goes way back.
Sure, thanks for your question. It's a complicated one, and people have written many books about all of those issues. I'm not going to write a book, but I will just say two things about it. I think that the issue of definitions of Zionism is a complex one, because there was a religious Zionism in Jewish traditions that go back thousands of years, next year in Jerusalem, something like that. But political Zionism is a much more recent phenomenon. So I think that's one thing that we need to keep in mind. And for a lot of people, Zionism, because it did emerge in the context of decolonization, national liberation movements, relate to it as a liberation movement for Jews who had gone through, the European Jews who had gone through the Holocaust. And, of course, in the context of the US and the UK refusing to allow entry to Jews who had escaped or survived the Holocaust because of both anti-communism and anti-Semitism, you had growing support for the creation of a explicitly Jewish state as a way of dealing with the problem, as you said it, what they called the Jewish problem after the war of displaced people. The other question is about colonialism, and I'll just say about that I think while there were lots of reasons that people came to support Zionism, it didn't become a majority view among Jews until after the Holocaust, but there were always Jewish supporters of it in smaller numbers. But the link that I think is so important was in the origins of political Zionism. Theodor Herzl, the guy who wrote the book The Jewish State that kind of identified the whole idea, he thought that, they realized they would have to have an imperialist sponsor, and so they went to a bunch of different countries, tried to get the head of the Ottoman Empire, the head of the British Empire, the head of the Russian Empire. They were hoping that one of them would kind of adopt this project, and they never did. But what Herzl thought was the Brits are the best chance. So he really wanted to get the British crown to embrace this project. Couldn't do it. So he writes a letter to Cecil Rhodes. You all remember Cecil Rhodes, right? The infamous colonialist of the UK who wanted to steal most of Africa for the British crown. So he writes to him and he says, will you help me? Will you help me in this project? And he says, you might wonder, why am I asking you? You're interested in Africa. I'm interested in this little piece of Arabia. You're concerned about Englishmen. I'm concerned about Jews. So why am I bothering you with this? And then he answers his own question in the letter, and he says, because our projects are both something colonial. For me, that was the beginning of my break with Zionism. I read that and I said, wait a minute, nobody ever taught me that. I didn't know that. And I think that's the essence of it. There were and are plenty of people for whom the word Zionism does not mean colonialism. It means something else. But what's important is the thinking of the people who actually created it. People can think what they want about it, but people can think that manifest destiny in the United States was a good thing, I suppose. But you have to look at what actually happened to the people who suffered it, right? So that's where I think we get to the question of Zionism. Yeah.
Hi there, my name is Michael, I'm from Portland. I have a question about the current political moment that we're in here in the United States. Obviously, everything about Israel's existence and behavior and military might depends on American colonial sponsorship. And I've been really shocked and pleasantly surprised, of course, under terrible circumstances, that the sentiment of a large mass of Americans has moved against Israel because of what's happened in the last 2 years. And the polls, certainly amongst people who vote Democratic, are really, really, really high. So with all that in mind, there clearly is a lag between what you might call the Democratic base and the Democratic leadership is, and I think that's the political task that we face over the next couple of years. We have three people who vote, three of our congressional leaders who vote with Democrats here. Maybe one of them might be called the Democratic leader out of the three of them, especially on this issue. But kind of what is your sense of the work that's being done nationally, and what are your recommendations for the kind of work we do here to try and end that contradiction and get the Democratic Party leadership on board with where the base is, which is to stop all of this?
Thank you, Michael. I think what we might do, just in the interest of time, is take a few questions, just so that more people get to ask their question, and then Phyllis will heroically answer a few of them together. So maybe we'll take two more questions,
Sure.
Okay, and then.
Hi, just want to get into the weeds a little bit more. Could you maybe give us a little bit more on how the British mandate in Palestine itself could be a sort of weakening of Palestinian society in order to set up the ethnic cleansing project of the Nakba, which would eventually lead to where we are today?
Yeah, thanks, Phyllis, for a truly wonderful, thought-provoking talk. I just have a quick question on the media, the takeovers that are happening now, the way the Ellisons are moving, and what is happening in terms of social media, which was so important in convincing so many young Americans, especially, that what is happening is wrong. How do you see this whole blitz to consolidate the media in the hands of pro-Israel people affecting our movement?
Yeah. Wow. These are really good concerns, all of them. I have a few ideas, but hopefully, I think a lot of you do too. So feel free to say ideas, not only ask questions. On the thing about the leadership issue, the gap between electeds and the base, I think it's true in all parties. I work at a nonprofit organization where we don't take positions on parties, and we are very nonpartisan. It doesn't mean we love them all. It sort of means, well, whatever. So we don't work just with one party or anything like that. But I would say that all parties right now are facing huge levels of opposition from their political base. I think as an analyst looking at it, I can say that the Democrats have a bigger gap, it seems, than the Republicans. The Republican leadership is closer to their base. But on the other hand, their base is smaller relative to the Democratic base, which is much larger, but there's a bigger gap with the electeds and the leadership. I think this is in some ways, it's interesting. It's a similar model to what we saw in the protests, where you saw the official kind of protests not talking about Palestine because they were, for whatever reason, afraid that some people wouldn't agree with them, afraid of funders, afraid of who knows what. It just wasn't there. But then people just took it on their own. You saw that in the Democratic Party at the DNC, for instance. The DNC refused to allow even a completely anodyne speech by this member of the state Senate in Georgia, who happens to be Palestinian. Her speech was not about Palestine. It had literally 2 lines in it. That was it. And they would not let her on the stage. It was like, what are you thinking? If you want to win this election, So that was a very clear mistake that they made. As I say, I think other parties have made similar mistakes of just not reading the room of where their base is. And I think in Congress, certainly the money historically has played a big role. Money that used to be really AIPAC. Now it comes from a lot of different sources. The pro-Israel lobbies are much broader than they used to be. The Christian Zionist movement is enormously powerful, enormously wealthy, and enormously influential in Congress, more in the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. So all of this is in flux, right? But what's not in flux is that there is this question about where the people are. And this goes partly to Nancy's point about the media. Part of the reason, in my view, probably the biggest reason for the rise of what I was calling the parallel movement, the ceasefire movement that is adjacent to, but not exactly part of, the Palestinian freedom movement, was because of what we were seeing on our phones, our computers, our televisions, day after day, hour after hour. And there wasn't much that the media companies could do about that. Their algorithms can do all kinds of damage, and they are, and that's all certainly true. But people also have contacts now all over the world. And they don't stop, they don't stop people from sending emails and the old-fashioned kinds of social media, So that's still there. So this gap is a huge one. But I think at the end of the day, the money money doesn't buy votes. Money buys media time. It buys access. But at the end of the day, if you're putting out ads, lots and lots and lots of expensive ads, that contradict what people that have to do the voting are seeing themselves, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. So I'm optimistic a little bit on that front. On this weedy question about the British mandate, I don't know. I haven't done enough research on that question to know, like, was it a deliberate effort to, with the expectation of ethnic cleansing? I do go by the old saying, which I forget exactly how it goes, but essentially it's like, if you can attribute something to stupidity rather than evil, probably you're right. So, I have some doubts about how strategic the British colonialists of the 1910s and 1915s and 1917 period were in looking forward to what they were going to be like as colonial powers 50 years later. So I tend to think that wasn't their intention at the time, that they were just stupid. But I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe other people here do. And then just back to the media stuff on Nancy's question for a minute. I mean, I think it's incredibly dangerous. But I think the irony is that on the issue of Palestine, it's in some ways less dangerous than some others. Not because they're not making more of an effort on it. They certainly are. There's real effort to create algorithms that can point to words and all of that. But there's an incredible fight back underway on the specifics of how Palestine is being affected by these algorithmic, is that the right word? Algorithmic changes, right? So I think, again, we have a better shot at it. This is where money really does matter. This new takeover of, what is it, Netflix pulled out, and now it's, yeah. You see, you guys know much more about this than I do. I can never keep track of these companies. But I do know is that these really right-wing billionaires are going to be controlling news agencies, from CNN to whatever, and they're also going to have entertainment, which means, remember the impact of the film Exodus? Yeah, see this, I'm looking around, I see a lot of hair like mine coming white. A lot of people here remember the film, which came out in 1964. It was based on a fantastic novel, a brilliantly written novel, that was commissioned by the Zionist movement of its day to write a novel explaining the foundation of Israel. And it's a brilliant novel. It's, great characters, it's really moving, all that stuff. You could spend, as I did as a 10-year-old kid, you could spend the whole summer on the beach reading that novel. And then it was starring the handsome Paul Newman and, what was her name, as the beautiful, who? Eva Marie Saint, exactly, the blonde, beautiful Shiksa who fell in love with Zionism and fell in love with a wonderful orphan from the Holocaust and fell in love with Paul Newman, of course. We were all transfixed by this. That kind of stuff. So they're going to be in charge of also movies. Oh, my God. So this is a lot to worry about. This is what we need to be very aware of. It's not only that they're going to prevent certain information from getting out, because ultimately the information gets out. But to a lot of people who don't rely on social media, particularly older people, and people who don't have access to 24/7 good quality internet access, poor people, that's who's not going to get that information. So it becomes a class issue as well in terms of how it's going to affect.
Thank you so much for that. I know we started a little bit. Two more questions? Okay. I know we started a little bit late, and there's a lot more conversation to be had. I think maybe we'll take two more questions, and then I know there are more people who want to ask, so maybe we can, if you can save your question, we can bring it into the next, or your comment to bring it into the next session and keep the conversation going. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for your good and important work. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I was one of those 29% who abstained from the presidential. So I served as a protective presence in Duma and Mukmas last month, and until then I was not aware. I was aware of the West Bank, but not as aware really as I thought I was. And so I have a concern that the awareness that's been raised on Gaza and the important work that the American people have done, while good, I think there's still a level of ignorance on the West Bank. And I want to know what your thoughts are about really expanding the knowledge base there so that people can act while the issue is still on people's radar. Because when buildings start going up in Gaza, I'm afraid that the attention span of U.S. citizens is going to back off. I also wondered if you would talk about the laws that have been passed in Israel that, of course, are not recognized by international law, but for the expansion of land grab in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and if you think that there is some strategic role there for Netanyahu in the upcoming elections. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sydney. I'm from Augusta. In the name of, I have a reflection from your speech that you had given. In the name of remembering history and recognizing our own culpability in what's going on globally and at home, there have been a couple of mentions made of our own land recognition from the Wabanaki Nations. The Wabanaki Nations are made up of 5 different First Nations. And it's really important in this conversation to include the genocide that's still ongoing on our soil against the First Nations of Turtle Island. This is also not the first time that genocide hasn't been bragged about in media and in newspapers that happened against First Nations and Black Americans while it was ongoing. You asked whose land was this beforehand, earlier in your conversation, asking yourself, why did I not? It's really close to the whole point, because how can people ask themselves these questions and answer them honestly when doing so would entail recognizing whose land we are on and admit we benefit from the genocide that is still ongoing today? Mm-hmm. I just wanted to have everyone sit with that.
Yeah. That's great.
Thank you. I'm sorry, but very briefly, a clarification on the mandate, because I've done some work on the question of Palestinian citizenship in the past. And the mandate clearly, part of the purpose of the mandate, clearly stated in the actual charter of it, is to assist in the creation of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. That was all part of that. But when you look at the British Order in Council, what became known as the the Palestine Citizenship Law of 1925, it stated very clearly, of course they couldn't say Jewish or not Jewish, but they said, of course, anyone in Palestine that chooses to migrate to where they can be with people of the same race are free to do so.
I didn't know that. I take it back, it wasn't just stupidity. Also, very important points, questions and important comments. On the question about the West Bank, I mean, the irony, of course, is that until October 7th of 2023, people who knew something about the Palestinians basically knew about the West Bank. Gaza hardly existed in the public consciousness. When the eruption happened of this genocide, that changed. I think that what's happening, I mean, the conditions, the Palestinians are speaking, as many of you know, of the Gazification of the West Bank. There's been over 1,110, I think is the number, something like that, Palestinians who have been killed in the 2.5 years since the genocide in Gaza began by a combination of settlers and soldiers. The settlers, of course, armed and protected by the soldiers, but often both of them participating. I think it's, one of the things is that in the West Bank, it's still possible for people to go. You were on a delegation doing observation work and escort work, and those are very, very important. There's lots of organizations these days that can go to the West Bank. It's not easy. I don't encourage people to go on their own, but that people go with groups, and that's important. And it means a big obligation when those groups come back, right? You don't go just to see. You go to see and report back to the letters to the editor, calling the radio talk shows, talking to your local trade union, sending messages to your child's school, all those things. You know, that becomes our obligation as well, because this is about Palestine. It's not just about Gaza. And that includes East Jerusalem as well. So it's all of that to be taken into account. On the point about indigenous rights in the context of genocide, it's so crucially important, and I really appreciate you raising it. And of course, there are those links of earlier genocides. I mean, one of the things when we started hearing the language of the Gaza genocide from Israeli officials, one of them that stuck with me, because it had emerged earlier, about 10 or 15 years ago, somebody who's in the Knesset talked about the need to kill the little snakes because they will grow up to be big snakes. And that resonated because there's a famous saying from the commander of the U.S. troops in Sand Creek in Colorado, the Sand Creek massacre that occurred in Colorado during what was known as the Indian Wars in those days. And what happened was there was a group of indigenous people who lived on that land who had built they were wintering on the side of the river and were ordered to go there. The troops that were there, the Colorado troops, were ordered to go and kill them. And a scouting party came back and said, we can't just kill them. It's a whole community. There's old people, there's babies. And the answer, and this came from the commander who happened to be a Methodist minister, of all things at the time, said, kill them all, nits make lice. That was the image, that the nits would grow up to be lice, the babies would grow up to be, yeah. So that has been a part of what genocide looked like in this country from the beginning, and it's a lesson that was clearly learned by Israeli settler colonial rule, that they are applying those same principles, that everyone is to be killed, that this is not about a war with an armed group. It's about killing of a people. And that's our job, to fight back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phyllis, and thank you everyone for your wonderful questions.